Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. The air left my lungs like I'd been punched. I was standing in the front hall of the Astor House penthouse with one hand still curled around the strap of my handbag, staring at my daughter-in-law while the chandelier spilled hard white light over polished marble and brushed brass and the line of anniversary guests pretending not to stare. Sloane Whitmore had one manicured hand braced against the doorframe, the other flattened over the silk at her waist as if she were physically holding her place in the room. My son Daniel stood a step behind her in a black dinner jacket, jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder. Her mother, Celeste Mercer, adjusted the cuff of her ivory suit and looked at me with that delicate, practiced pity women like her wear better than jewelry. A waiter froze near the bar cart with a tray of coupe glasses trembling slightly in his hands. No one moved. No one breathed. "You're not coming in," Sloane said. He said it clearly. Not quietly. Not privately. Loud enough for the people near the piano. Loud enough for Daniel's law partner and his wife. Loud enough for the caterer arranging oysters on crushed ice 10 feet away. I felt my pulse drop into a cold, precise rhythm. My name is Helena Whitmore. I'm 60 years old. And this is the story of how I let my son and his wife believe they had erased me, only to take back my name, my company, and every illusion they built on top of my silence. I looked past Sloane into the apartment I had helped Daniel buy 8 years earlier, when Graham and I were still alive together in the world and believed generosity bred loyalty. The walnut floors gleamed under the recessed lighting. White orchids stood in low crystal bowls on every table. The anniversary cake was already set beneath the window wall, 5 tiers of pale sugar flowers and gold leaf, as polished and bloodless as a sculpture. Someone had chosen the music badly. A string quartet version of an old jazz standard rose from hidden speakers, elegant and tinny and cruel. "Excuse me," I said. Sloane's smile never reached her eyes. "We talked about this." "No," I said evenly. "You sent a text at 11:30 this morning." Daniel shifted, finally looking at me. His fingers went to his cufflink, twisting it once, then again. He had done that since he was 12 whenever he wanted to be anywhere else. "Mom," he said, "tonight is just, it's smaller than you think." Celeste let out the faintest breath through her nose. Her heels struck the marble like a metronome as she came to stand beside her daughter. "Helena," she said in that low, lacquered voice of hers, "surely we can preserve a little dignity. There are insults that land with force and there are insults that slide in cleanly between the ribs." That one slid. Behind them I saw Julia Baines from the museum board lower her champagne glass without drinking. I saw Everett Cole, Daniel's college friend, glance down at his shoes. I saw one of the younger servers look at me with the startled sympathy reserved for animals hit in traffic. Sloane folded her arms. "This evening is for people who support our marriage." It was almost impressive, the confidence with which she said it. She had a talent for turning theft into curation, cruelty into taste. That was her gift. She could remove you from your own life and make it sound like housekeeping. "And I don't?" I asked. Her head tilted. "Not in a way that feels healthy." Daniel took half a step forward. "Sloane." "No," she snapped, then softened instantly when she looked at him. "No, Daniel. We agreed. Boundaries." There was the word they had been seasoning into every conversation for months. Boundaries. Space. Transition. New chapter. The language people use when they want something of yours but don't want to sound greedy asking for it. Celeste touched Sloane's elbow, the gesture so slight it might have looked loving to anyone who didn't know her. What it really meant was proceed. "We don't need a scene," she said. I let my gaze drift over all of them. Sloane with her chin lifted too high. Daniel with his shoulders rounded inward. Celeste standing perfectly straight, one hand resting over the clasp of her handbag as if she were attending a luncheon instead of an execution. They had gathered around that doorway like jurors around a verdict, and for a moment I understood exactly what they thought this was. They thought humiliation would make me small. They thought public embarrassment would make me emotional. They thought if they shoved me outside the room I would start pleading to be let back in. Instead, I set my handbag down on the console table with deliberate care. I removed my gloves finger by finger and laid them on top. "Then let's not make one," I said calmly. For the first time Sloane blinked. I turned to Daniel. "Look at me." He did. "I came because you said last week you wanted family there." His throat moved. "Mom, And because your father never missed an anniversary dinner after our first year, even when we were broke and living over a construction office that smelled like wet drywall. Sloane's expression hardened. She hated Graham being mentioned in rooms where she couldn't control the version of him being remembered. To her, my late husband was useful as a framed photograph and a founding story for the Whitmore House collection. Less useful as a man with intentions written into legal documents. This isn't about your marriage to my father, she said. No, I replied. Clearly it isn't. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the servers knew enough to become invisible. Celeste gave Daniel a look. Say something. He rubbed the back of his neck. Mom, maybe we do lunch next week. Just us. Lunch. After being barred from my own son's 10th anniversary as if I were a disruptive ex-employee. I nodded slowly. Of course. Relief flashed across Sloane's face too quickly for her to hide it. She had expected resistance. She had prepared for tears. What she did not know, what none of them knew while they stood there in their expensive light and polished surfaces, was that I had been waiting for them to overplay their hand for almost 4 months. I picked up my gloves. You should enjoy your evening. Sloane frowned. That's it. I met her eyes. For now. Then I turned and walked out. No shaking voice. No slammed door. No scene. Just the clean click of my heels over the marble lobby downstairs, the bronze elevator doors sliding shut, and my reflection in the mirrored panel. Pearl earrings, navy silk dress, spine straight, face composed. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed the only sign of what I was feeling, that my hands resting lightly over my handbag were very still. The ride down from the 36th floor took less than a minute. It felt longer. Outside, the city was damp from a passing spring shower. Taxis hissed along Madison Avenue. The doorman lifted a hand to call my driver, but I told him I preferred to walk. I took 3 blocks in heels over wet pavement before I let myself breathe properly. 10 years earlier, when Daniel married Sloane Mercer in the Winter Garden at the Leland Hotel, I told myself she was sharp because the world rewards sharpness in young women if it's wrapped in beauty and discipline. She was 27 then, all sleek dark hair and narrow gold bracelets, with a smile that could make donors loosen their checkbooks and junior staff apologize for things they hadn't done. She came from old Connecticut money that had become less old and much less money by the time I met her, but Celeste maintained the performance brilliantly. They knew which forks to use, which schools to reference, which charities to attach themselves to. They also knew value when they saw it. At first I thought they saw value in Daniel. Later I understood they saw value in access. By the time I reached my townhouse on East 79th, the worst of the sting had cooled into something more useful. Agnes, who had been with me for 23 years and could read my face better than most family, opened the door before I reached for the bell. You're early, she said quietly. I was uninvited at the threshold, I replied, handing her my coat. Her expression changed by degrees. Do you want tea or something stronger? Tea first. My house was warm and dim in the way only old houses can be, lamplight soft over crown molding and dark rugs and books that had absorbed decades of weather. The foyer smelled faintly of beeswax and lilacs from the arrangement Agnes kept near the stair. I moved through the drawing room without turning on the overhead fixture. I preferred the pools of amber cast by the sconces. They made everything look steadier than I felt. Agnes brought Darjeeling on a silver tray. I sat at the small writing desk by the window, untied my gloves and finally checked my phone. There were already 2 texts from Daniel. Mom, I'm sorry it happened like that. Let's talk tomorrow. Not sorry it happened. Sorry it happened like that. I set the phone face down. At 9:14 p.m., while the steam still rose in thin ribbons from my cup, another notification lit the screen. This one wasn't a message. It was an Instagram alert forwarded automatically from a monitoring tag Victor Ruiz had set up for me 2 months earlier when I told him I wanted to know every time my family used the Whitmore name publicly for brand content. Celeste Mercer had posted a photo. I opened it. There they were beneath the glass ceiling of the Astor House Conservatory, golden light falling through suspended votives, everyone arranged in curated intimacy around the cake. Sloane stood in the center in white silk, one hand on Daniel's arm, chin lifted. Daniel smiled the way people smile in photographs when they've stopped feeling whatever the occasion is supposed to represent. Celeste had captioned it, "A Decade of Love. Family Only." I stared at it for 2 seconds, then 3. And then I smiled. Because in the mirrored panel behind the cake, just to the left of the orchids, reflected backward and small but unmistakable, was Martin Sloan. Not Sloan, my daughter-in-law. Martin Sloan, partner at Ridley Pierce Advisory, the estate consultant Daniel had insisted I meet in January and I had declined. He was standing beside the service credenza with a folio open in his hand. And seated at the small side table near the window, half obscured by the floral arrangement, was a notary I recognized from the family office downtown. Even in reflection I could make out the cream stalk and the blue tab dividers. Estate transfer packet. Signature flags already placed. Agnes was watching me from the doorway. What is it? I enlarged the image. The mirrored reflection blurred slightly, but it was enough. It seems, I said, taking a slow sip of tea, they decided to document the conspiracy for me. At 9:18 I called Naomi Bishop. She answered on the second ring. No greeting, just, you sound calm. That's either very good or very bad. Very good, I said. Celeste posted it. A beat. Posted what? The evidence. By 10 o'clock Naomi had the screenshot, the original link, the metadata Victor had scraped before Celeste could delete anything, and instructions from me that were very simple. Freeze nothing yet. File nothing yet. Let them sleep. Then I sat in my drawing room with the lamplight brushing the spines of Graham's architecture books and let the rest of the evening settle around me. 4 months earlier, I had noticed someone had printed 47 pages from the study printer at 2:13 in the morning while I was in Charleston reviewing the Harbor Lane acquisition. The paper tray was low when I returned. The print log showed a file name I had never created. Trust_transition_final2. Daniel denied knowing anything about it. Sloan laughed and said technology was always making things look dramatic. But Victor, who handled cybersecurity for 3 of our properties and had helped untangle a vendor breach the previous year, found the remote login came from Daniel's apartment. That was the first thing. The second was Martin Sloan appearing in my orbit less than 2 weeks later, introduced through Celeste at a charity breakfast as someone who helps families modernize cumbersome old structures. He said old structures the way some people say mold. The third was Sloan herself asking unusually detailed questions about governance language in the Whitmore Family Trust over lunch at Avignon. Not emotional questions. Not sentimental ones. Clause questions. Quorum questions. Incapacity definitions. Transfer restrictions. By then I had already retained Naomi. I did not accuse anyone. I did not warn anyone. I simply began leaving doors unlocked that I wanted tested. A folder in my study labeled Board Transition Notes. A draft memo on my laptop titled Retirement Scenarios. A printed packet with highlighted sections that suggested, very conveniently, that a temporary proxy could become a permanent operational transfer if supported by a unanimous family advisory vote. Every page contained a microscopic tracking mark Victor inserted. One sentence in the proxy clause carried an intentional error Naomi wrote herself. A semicolon where legal language requires a comma. Tiny. Meaningless to most people. Fatal in court. I made sure they'd find exactly what I wanted them to find. At 7:12 the next morning, my phone rang before the kettle finished boiling. Daniel. I let it ring twice before answering. Good morning. His voice was too bright. Mom. Can we come by? We. He hesitated. Sloan and I. I looked out through the kitchen window at the narrow garden, wet brick dark from rain, ivy shining under the gray morning light. You may. They arrived at 8:15. Sloan wore cream cashmere and oversized sunglasses she removed only after Agnes led them into the breakfast room. Daniel hadn't shaved. He looked hollowed out. Good. Let him feel one restless night before the real ones began. The breakfast room had pale blue walls, limestone underfoot, and a long oak table Graham commissioned from a millworker in Vermont in 1998. Morning light fell across it in clean white bands. I was already seated with coffee, toast untouched, my iPad angled beside the silver marmalade jar. Sloan entered first, moving fast, all sharpened edges. Daniel followed slower, shoulders tight. This needs to stop, Sloan said before either of them sat down. I looked up. Good morning to you as well. Daniel pulled out a chair. He didn't sit. Mom, Celeste's post got a lot of attention and apparently Julia Baines called Aunt Patricia. And now people are saying you were excluded and it's turning into something ugly. Something ugly, I repeated. Sloane removed her gloves with quick, irritated movements. You know exactly what I mean. If you start telling people I humiliated you. If. Her jaw flexed. Helena, don't do that. Do what? That calm thing, she snapped. Where you act like everyone else is irrational. I folded my hands. Sit down. Neither of them moved. All right, I said. Then stand. I turned the iPad toward them and opened Celeste's photograph. Sloane glanced at it and exhaled sharply. I already know what Mom posted. No, I said. You know what she thought she posted. I enlarged the mirrored background. Martin. The notary. The folio. The timestamp in the upper corner. Daniel's face changed first. Not dramatically. Just a subtle draining, as if someone had pulled a shade inside him. Sloane leaned closer. That proves nothing. On its own, no. I tapped once more. The next screen showed the original file metadata Victor had pulled, with location stamps from the conservatory and a second image Celeste had deleted 43 seconds later. In that one, Martin's hand was visible on the table. The top sheet in the folio showed enough of a title for Naomi to identify the template series. Amendment and Proxy Assignment. Ridley Pierce letterhead. Sloane's mouth parted. How do you have that? Because your mother is careless. Daniel sat down heavily. I slid a slim cream folder across the table. Open it. He looked at me, then at the folder, and finally did. Inside were 3 items. A copy of the printer access log from my study. A still image from my townhouse security camera showing Daniel entering that study at 11:42 p.m. on February 16 with a key he was not aware had been temporarily recoded to record entry. And a 2-page memo from Victor tracing the distribution of the decoy proxy language from my computer to Daniel's home Wi-Fi 40 minutes later. Sloane did not touch the folder. This is insane. No, I said quietly. This is documentation. Daniel stared at the camera still. You recorded me? I secured my home. You think I stole from you? I held his gaze. I think you came into my study after midnight, printed from my computer, and took documents you were not authorized to access. I know that because I can see you doing it. Sloane finally sat down. Her bracelets clicked against the table. You can't prove intent. I reached for my coffee. Took one measured sip. Set it back down. Actually, I can. From the second folder, I removed a bank statement and placed it in front of her. Then a vendor invoice. Then a corporate card summary. 3 months ago, I said, Marlowe Brand Studio billed Whitmore House Collection $28,000 for strategic celebration assets. Those assets appear to have included your anniversary invitations, floral deposits, and media photography. Daniel looked up. That's not. I placed the invoice directly over his hand. It gets better. Another page. Shell Company registration. Ownership chain. Sloane Mercer Whitmore beneficial interest through Mercer Creative Holdings. Her throat worked once. That's a consulting vehicle. It's a pass-through account, I said. And using company funds to host a private event while preparing a transfer document you intended to execute off-book is clumsy. Naomi was almost disappointed. Daniel pushed back from the table. Mom, listen. No. You listen. My voice did not rise. Didn't need to. I know about Martin Sloane. I know about the notary. I know about the draft proxy built from language you lifted from my study. I know you planned to frame my exclusion from that dinner as evidence that I was becoming volatile and disruptive, because Martin's office also prepared an incapacity briefing memo you were planning to circulate to the board if I resisted. Would you like to see that too, or is this enough for breakfast? Sloane looked at Daniel so fast her earring brushed her neck. You told me that memo wasn't finalized. He stared at her. I told you not to use Martin until we knew. Until we knew she'd sign, Sloane shot back. The room tightened like wire. I let the implications settle over the table. Then I took out my phone, opened a voicemail transcript, and placed that down as well. And because you both seem to be having a difficult morning, here's the part where your consultant offered Agnes $10,000 to tell him whether I'd seen a neurologist. Daniel went utterly still. Sloane's hand flew to her mouth. He what? Daniel asked. Agnes, from the doorway with the coffee pot in her hands, said in a flat voice. He thought I was cheap. For the first time since they arrived, Sloane looked genuinely afraid. I leaned back. You wanted a boundary. Here it is. At 9:30 this morning, you will both be at Bishop, Vale and Klein with your personal counsel. Martin will be there. So will the notary from last night. If any of you decide not to come, Naomi files by noon. Daniel's voice cracked on the last word. Files what? I met his eyes. Everything. Sloane pushed to her feet. You're overreacting. Am I? This can be handled privately. I rose too, slower than she did. It could have been handled privately before you tried to strip authority from me with a forged proxy and a social media caption. Daniel looked wrecked now, one hand over his mouth, the other braced on the back of the chair. Mom. I picked up my gloves. Actually, I said and let the word land cleanly between us, you were committing fraud. No one answered. At the door, Sloane turned back, her composure fraying at the edges. You set us up. I looked at her without blinking. No. I gave you choices. You kept making the same one. They left with the kind of hurried dignity that only makes panic more visible. Daniel forgot his scarf. Sloane asked Agnes for water and then didn't drink it. When the front door closed, Agnes looked at me. Do you want the good china put away? I smiled faintly. No. Leave it out. Then I called Naomi and said, they're on their way. They thought they had embarrassed me into silence, but they had no idea I had spent 4 months building the room where they were about to come apart. Bishop, Vale and Klein occupied the top 2 floors of a limestone building on 47th Street with brass elevators, thick carpet, and the kind of controlled quiet that makes people lower their voices without being asked. Naomi reserved the main conference suite for noon. The room had a long mahogany table polished so perfectly it reflected the recessed lights like still water, leather chairs the color of dark cognac, and a wall of windows looking down over Midtown in sheets of pale spring sun. Authority has a smell in places like that. Waxed wood. Fluffy. Paper. Expensive restraint. I arrived 5 minutes early with Victor Ruiz and Priya Desai, our forensic accountant. Naomi stood near the window in charcoal silk, reviewing a binder tabbed in 4 colors. She was 52, silver at the temples, precise in the way only truly dangerous women can afford to be. When she saw me, she gave one short nod. Ready? Yes. They brought counsel. Good. And Martin arrived 17 minutes ago looking as if he'd discovered religion. That nearly made me laugh. Daniel and Sloane came in together at noon exactly, but there was no grandeur left in either of them. Daniel's tie was slightly off-center. He kept adjusting his watchband. Sloane had changed into a dove-gray sheath dress and pearl studs, armor chosen to suggest maturity and innocence at once. It didn't work. Celeste followed them and I admit that was the one surprise. She wore black sunglasses indoors for the first 20 seconds before removing them with visible irritation. Behind them came Martin Sloane, already sweating through the collar of his pale blue shirt, and a young attorney from Ridley Pierce whose expression suggested he'd been awake all night reading Disaster. The notary, Leo Ferris, arrived separately, carrying a leather folio to his chest as if it might shield him. No one hugged. No one pretended this was a misunderstanding. Naomi waited until everyone was seated. Then she began. For the record, she said, voice level, this meeting concerns an attempted fraudulent governance transfer involving the Whitmore Family Trust, Whitmore House Collection voting rights, misuse of corporate funds, unlawful access to protected property, and potential defamation strategy related to a fabricated incapacity narrative. Daniel inhaled sharply. Sloane went white around the mouth. Celeste turned to Martin so slowly it was almost elegant. Naomi clicked a remote. The screen at the end of the room lit up. Let's start with timeline. This more than anything changed the air. Allegations can be argued. Timelines are harder to charm. January 9th. Celeste Mercer introduces Martin Sloane to Helena Whitmore at the Lennox Foundation breakfast. January 14th. Daniel Whitmore requests trust summary packet from Family Office Assistant Lydia Kerr without board authorization. February 16th, 11:42 p.m. Daniel enters Helena Whitmore's private study. Printer log begins 2:13 a.m. Decoy proxy language accessed. February 17th, 3:01 a.m. File fragment containing intentional syntax error appears in Martin Sloane's draft amendment notes. March 2nd. Mercer Creative Holdings opens temporary billing line through Marlowe Brand Studio. March 11th. Ridley Pierce requests template language concerning temporary incapacity and emergency governance continuity. April 3rd. Leo Ferris, notary, receives calendar hold for private family dinner signing. April 18th. Celeste Mercer posts celebratory anniversary image from Astor House Conservatory at 9:14 p.m., capturing reflected presence of consultant and notary within signed amendment packet. Naomi paused. Premeditation is much easier to establish when people insist on documenting it. Martin's attorney cleared his throat. This characterization is. Naomi held up one hand. We haven't even reached characterization. Priya took over with the financials. She was small, composed, and had a way of speaking that made every sentence sound already verified twice. She walked through the billing trail from Whitmore House Collection to Marlowe Brand Studio to Mercer Creative Holdings and back out into personal event expenditures. Florals. Photography. Venue surcharge. Security. Private car service. A celebratory dinner disguised as a strategy line item. Sloane's lawyer tried to interrupt on materiality grounds. Priya slid the full ledger across the table without changing expression. It's all tabbed. Back to him in kinder language than they deserved. That woman was not at the table. Victor presented next. Access logs. Printer fingerprinting. Motion-triggered footage from my study hallway. Then, with a precision I knew Daniel would hate, he projected the decoy file itself. Naomi pointed to clause 12. Do you see this punctuation mark, Mr. Sloane? Martin swallowed. Yes. That semicolon does not belong in any valid transfer instrument under New York trust law. It was inserted intentionally in a bait draft by my office on February 10th. Your amendment packet from last night reproduces it exactly. Martin said nothing. Naomi's tone did not change. Meaning the underlying language did not come from any legitimate trust summary. It came from stolen draft material. Daniel looked at Martin. You told us it was standard. Martin finally found his voice. I was told the source was internal and authorized. Sloane whipped toward him. By who? He stared back at her. By your husband. Daniel slammed his palm against the table. Don't do that. Celeste closed her eyes for a moment, perhaps the only honest gesture I'd ever seen from her. Naomi let the fracture widen. Then she placed a small digital recorder in the center of the table. One more item before we discuss options. Agnes's voice filled the room, steady and unimpressed, as Martin offered money for information about my health, my medication, my appointments. Then Martin's own voice, lower now, saying, if she seems forgetful, that helps. The silence afterward had weight. Celeste's head turned toward him in increments. You approached household staff? Martin tried to recover. It was exploratory. Exploratory. Celeste repeated, and for the first time the polish cracked. You imbecile. Sloane was staring at Daniel as though she no longer recognized the architecture of his face. Tell me you didn't know about that. Daniel said nothing. Daniel. He rubbed both hands over his mouth. I knew he was trying to get a sense of whether Mom was seeing someone. I didn't know he'd bribe staff. Celeste laughed once. It was a terrible sound. That is not the defense you think it is. Then Naomi delivered the part one had saved for the center of the room. There is one additional witness, she said. Someone the Mercer-Whitmore side appears to have relied upon for internal communications cleanup and file handling. Daniel frowned. What witness? Naomi glanced at Victor, who opened the door. In walked Celeste Mercer's executive assistant, Eliza Warren. Not a junior clerk. Not an outsider. Eliza had been with Celeste for 11 years. She scheduled board lunches, charity galas, private travel, donor calls. She knew where everything lived because she carried half of Celeste's life in labeled folders and calm discretion. Sloane recoiled. Eliza. Eliza set a banker's box on the side credenza and folded her hands. She wore a navy suit and no expression at all. Naomi said, Ms. Warren came forward yesterday evening after determining she was being positioned to absorb responsibility for payments routed through Mercer-affiliated accounts. Celeste turned slowly toward her. You went to Helena? Eliza met her eyes. I went to Mrs. Whitmore because your daughter instructed me to backdate an invoice and route it through the Mercer Family Arts Fund. Then Mr. Whitmore asked me to delete calendar holds related to Mr. Ferris. Sloane's voice rose. You're my mother's assistant. And not your scapegoat, Eliza replied. That landed harder than anything so far. Naomi continued. Ms. Warren has provided original email chains, calendar exports, and 2 voice notes confirming the anniversary dinner was selected as cover for an execution attempt because, quote, Helena will never make a scene in front of donors. Sloane's eyes filled instantly, not with grief but fury. You recorded me? Eliza's answer was simple. I save everything. I looked at Daniel then because I wanted him to understand this part fully. He had not been outsmarted by luck. He had been undone by arrogance. The rest happened with the awful speed of structures collapsing from the middle. Martin demanded to speak only through counsel. Leo Ferris insisted he never notarized anything because no signatures were completed. Priya reminded the room that attempted execution still matters when paired with fraud preparation. Celeste began asking clipped, surgical questions that had nothing to do with protecting Sloane and everything to do with discovering how much exposure was now attached to the Mercer name. Sloane kept saying, we were trying to streamline things, which became less persuasive each time she repeated it. Daniel looked at me once and said quietly, now, why didn't you just ask me? I held his gaze. I wanted you to see them. His face tightened. He knew exactly what I meant. Not just them as in Sloane and Celeste and Martin. Them as in himself. His own appetite. His own willingness to let other people build a justification around me as long as it delivered him control without forcing him to say aloud what he wanted. Naomi slid the final packet across the table. Here are the terms. There were only 3. Daniel would resign immediately from any operational role within Whitmore House Collection and divest all contingent governance claims under the family trust in exchange for a structured personal settlement already provided for in Graham's estate. One far smaller than what he had hoped to leverage but enough to prevent me from being accused of vindictiveness. Sloane would repay the misused corporate funds within 30 days, acknowledge in writing that she had no governance standing in Whitmore House Collection, and agree to mutual non-disparagement provisions narrowly drafted not to interfere with legal disclosures. Ridley Pierce and Leo Ferris would submit to separate regulatory review, preserve all records and cooperate fully or face immediate civil filing and referral for criminal review. Martin's attorney looked ill. Sloane's lawyer asked for time. Celeste asked for a private caucus. Naomi said they had 20 minutes. During that break, I stood by the window with a glass of water and watched clouds move between the buildings. Victor joined me long enough to murmur, "You were right about the photo. I usually am when people are vain." He smiled. Celeste deleted it, by the way. Too late. When everyone returned, the room felt smaller. Not because it was, but because certainty had left it. Celeste sat straighter than before, but something in her had shifted. She no longer looked like a mother defending a daughter. She looked like a strategist calculating salvage. Daniel was the one who spoke first. "If I sign this, do you stop?" It was such a child's question. As if consequences were weather and I might decide to make the storm pass. Naomi answered before I could. "If you sign, cooperate, and comply, Mrs. Whitmore will pursue resolution through the terms before you rather than public litigation. If you do not, we proceed." Sloane turned to Daniel. "You can't be serious." He laughed under his breath, but there was no humor in it. "Serious? Sloane, there's video of me in her study. You were in your mother's house. At midnight." Celeste closed her eyes again briefly. "Enough." Sloane looked at her, stunned. "Mother. You used my assistant," Celeste said coldly. "You used my charity account routing. You let me post a photograph in a room where illegal paperwork was being staged. Do not say mother to me like I'm on your side out of habit." That was the moment the last illusion died. Sloane began to cry then, but even that seemed to anger her, as if tears were beneath the image she wanted to maintain. She dabbed at them too sharply, smearing mascara near the corner of one eye. Daniel reached toward her. She pulled away. Martin asked for a separate room with counsel. Leo Ferris requested a copy of the draft order of preservation. Priya handed it over. I remained seated. There is a particular sound expensive pens make when people sign documents they hoped never to see. Soft. Dry. Final. Daniel signed first. His hand trembled once near the bottom of page 6. Sloane waited until Celeste told her in a voice stripped of all ornament, "Either sign or prepare to be named publicly." Then she signed too, jaw clenched so tightly I thought she might crack a molar. Martin did not sign our civil terms, but his counsel executed the preservation agreement. Leo Ferris did the same. When it was over, Daniel set the pen down and stared at the paper as though it had been written by someone else's life. He looked at me. Was any of this salvageable? I considered him for a moment. My son. Graham's smile in a ruined posture. A man old enough to know exactly what he was doing, still hoping love would act like an eraser. Yes, I said. Before you chose performance over honesty. He looked down. Sloane stood. You've destroyed this family. I rose more slowly. No. Then I picked up my bag. You confused access with love, I said. That's what destroyed it. At the door, I paused and looked back at the table, at Celeste rigid with contained humiliation, at Daniel collapsed inward, at Sloane red-eyed and furious, at Martin sweating into his collar, at Naomi closing binders with the serene efficiency of a surgeon finishing a procedure. Next time, I said quietly, make sure they're not working for both sides. Then I left. The next few weeks were louder than I allowed into my home. Lawyers called. Accountants requested confirmations. Ridley Pierce announced Martin Sloane's immediate leave of absence. Leo Ferris retained criminal counsel. Daniel moved out of the Astor House penthouse and into a furnished apartment in Tribeca after 3 days of what I'm told were spectacular arguments involving a wine decanter, a framed wedding photograph, and Sloane's insistence that he had folded like paper. Celeste stopped returning certain social invitations, which in her world is how you announce a death without flowers. I did not respond to any of it quickly. There is power in refusing the tempo of people who thrive on crisis. 6 months later, I woke in my new apartment on Sutton Place to pale autumn light spreading across the kitchen counter like folded silk. I had sold the townhouse in August not because I was forced to and not because I was broken, but because I wanted less haunted square footage and more sky. The new place had limestone floors warmed by morning sun, steel-framed windows facing the river, and a narrow balcony where I could stand with coffee and watch the city reorganize itself each day. That first October morning I ground beans, opened the balcony door and let cold air move through the kitchen. Peace is not loud when it arrives. It's specific. Hot coffee in a heavy mug. Clean counters. No waiting for the next manipulation disguised as family conversation. People like Sloane imagine consequences arrive as thunder. Most of the time they arrive as paperwork, reputation, and people no longer picking up your calls. She lost Mercer Creative Holdings within 2 months. Once the repayment order and forensic review became impossible to spin, 2 clients quietly withdrew, then a third. The women's leadership panel she was scheduled to moderate in Nantucket replaced her with a non-profit executive from Boston. The social magazine that had once featured her effortless entertaining style ran a fall issue without mentioning her name at all. In some circles, absence is the loudest verdict. Daniel's consequences were different and, in their way, more exact. He didn't go to jail. I hadn't wanted prison theater. I wanted recognition. He resigned from the Whitmore board, lost his track at Holloway Price after the firm decided a man associated with attempted trust fraud was not the future face of private wealth advisory, and spent the winter doing contract document review for a boutique litigation shop in White Plains. A friend of Graham's saw him in the lobby there one Tuesday and called me afterward, not to gossip but because she sounded sad. He looked smaller, she said. Celeste suffered the sort of punishment women like her actually fear. Not money. Not immediately. Social displacement. 3 charity committees declined to renew her leadership terms the following season. The Lenox Arts Circle replaced her on the gala host roster with a younger patron whose fortune was newer and therefore cleaner. Donors who once hovered now nodded from a distance. She still had her apartment, her wardrobe, her name. What she lost was the assumption that those things would always protect her. Martin Sloane's bar inquiry became public record 8 weeks after the conference. He resigned before the hearing concluded. The notary, Leo Ferris, surrendered his commission and spent a season telling everyone within reach that he had merely been drawn into a family dispute. That phrasing never works as well as people hope. I built the practice for women like me at first. Widows. Founders. Older partners being edged out by children who believed inheritance meant acceleration. Then it widened. Sisters in business with brothers. Divorcing couples with jointly held properties. One restaurateur in Philadelphia whose son had been taking vendor kickbacks for 18 months. Word spreads when you solve problems without raising your voice. Priya joined me 1 day a week officially and, in practice, far more than that. Victor handled digital integrity reviews on retainer. Naomi sent me cases she couldn't advise on directly but knew I'd understand instinctively. The first time I walked into my own office and saw our name etched in frosted glass, I stood there longer than necessary. Not because it was grand. Because it was earned. One Thursday in March, Priya and I were having lunch at a small place on East 63rd with green leather banquettes and pressed tin ceilings. The soup was too salty. The bread was excellent. We had just finished discussing a Cleveland manufacturing dispute when she glanced at her phone and smiled. "What? You won't believe who I just saw," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "Daniel. At the county clerk's office." He was carrying 3 banker's boxes and looked like he was trying not to be recognized. I stirred my tea. Was he? Only by me. And I'm not proud of this, she said, but I enjoyed how carefully he avoided eye contact with everyone in the room. I let myself smile. That sounds human rather than unproud. She lifted her glass. To proportional consequences. I clinked mine lightly against it. Not everything that survived that year was professional. Some things were stranger. Softer. Celeste and I did not speak for nearly 4 months after the conference. Then in late February she requested 15 minutes. Not through lawyers. Directly. At Café Sabine on Madison at 11 in the morning. Public enough to prevent theatrics. Private enough for honesty if honesty decided to attend. She arrived in camel wool and dark glasses, carrying herself with the same rigid elegance she always had, but there was less theater in it now. We sat near the window under brushed brass sconces while rain stippled the glass. "I won't waste your time," she said. "That would be new," I replied. To her credit, she almost smiled. Then she placed a small envelope on the table. Inside was a handwritten note from Eliza Warren confirming Celeste had finalized her severance package and personally corrected every implication Sloane had tried to place on her. Attached was a second sheet, copies of 2 old internal Mercer emails Celeste had discovered after the conference. One showing Sloane had discussed using her mother's committee standing to neutralize Helena socially months before the anniversary dinner. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked. "Because I spent years mistaking my daughter's sharpness for intelligence," Celeste said. "And because, if I'm being honest, I mistook your restraint for weakness." The rain tapped harder against the window. I looked at her for a moment. Most people did. She folded her hands. "I posted that photograph to wound you." "I know." I didn't realize I was also photographing my own daughter's ruin. There was no apology in her tone exactly. Something rare. Recognition. We were never going to become friends in the ordinary way. But after that morning, something like civility rooted itself where hostility had exhausted the soil. She referred 2 governance clients to my office over the next 5 months. I accepted one. People like to believe alliances are built only from affection. Often they are built from mutual clarity. That evening, much later, with April almost over and the river turning copper under the descending sun, Celeste stood on my balcony holding a glass of white wine and watching the light move over the water. The sunset poured across the windows like honey. Far below us, headlights were coming on along the FDR, and the first city lights were waking one by one like a second constellation. She had stopped by after a fundraiser planning session we both attended for entirely separate reasons. We were older women on a narrow balcony, neither of us dressed for sentiment, both of us changed by the same disaster from opposite sides. "I still can't believe she chose the Astor House," Celeste said almost conversationally. I laughed softly. Vanity prefers scenic crime. That earned a dry laugh from her too. We touched glasses once, not in celebration of what happened, but in acknowledgement that it had ended. For a moment, standing there in the orange glow with the river below and the warmth of the apartment behind us, I thought about the woman I had been before all of it. Not innocent exactly. I had built hotels, negotiated contracts, buried a husband, stabilized payroll during a recession, and learned long ago that charm is often just appetite in a silk tie. But there had still been a kind of naivety in me where Daniel was concerned. A private superstition that motherhood grants immunity from betrayal if you love carefully enough. It doesn't. What it grants, if you're lucky and honest, is the chance to survive the truth when it arrives. I used to think strength looked like endurance. Taking more than other people knew. Making rooms comfortable. Translating bad behavior into stress. Greed into insecurity, disloyalty into confusion. That version of me was not weak. She was simply overtrained in mercy. The woman I am now is quieter than that one and harder in the right places. I no longer confuse keeping peace with protecting what matters. I no longer give people access just because they can pronounce the word family with the correct amount of feeling. I no longer wait at doors where I am not wanted. And in ways I would never say aloud where they could hear it, I am grateful to them. To Daniel for showing me that love without character becomes entitlement astonishingly fast. To Sloane for demonstrating that polish is not the same thing as depth, and that people who weaponize appearances usually die by them. To Celeste, oddly enough, for posting the photograph that turned suspicion into evidence. They were the fire. I became the architecture that survived it. Before she left, Celeste set her empty glass on the counter and looked out once more at the darkening river. Do you ever think about what would have happened if they'd simply asked you honestly for a transition plan? Yes, I said. And I watched the last line of gold fold itself behind the buildings. I would have helped, I said. That's the tragedy. After she left, I stayed on the balcony alone while the evening settled fully over the city. The glass door reflected a woman I recognized completely now. Not untouched. Not bitter. Not waiting for vindication from people too small to give it. Just steady. There are endings that feel like triumph, all bright noise and applause. Mine didn't. Mine felt warmer than that. Truer. Like finally setting down something heavy you had mistaken for your own responsibility. I raced the last of my wine toward the skyline, toward Graham's memory, toward the strange and costly education of the year behind me. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making the people who betrayed you suffer. It's about building a life so solid their chaos can never live inside it again. And if I've learned anything worth keeping, it's this. Sometimes the best justice isn't about destroying the people who wronged you. It's about becoming unrecognizable to the version of yourself that once thought you had to beg for a seat at their table.